My brother betrayed me with my girlfriend in my bed. My father kicked him out. Now, years later, he comes back begging for the inheritance. But when he found out Dad left me $80K and him only $5K, he never expected my answer. I'm 32 years old. Work as an operations manager at a logistics company, and there are still days when I wake up, and the first thing I think about is that afternoon when I came home early from track practice. It's been like 15 years now, but some things you just don't forget, you know? No matter how much time passes or how hard you try to get over it, there are moments that stay burned into your brain like they happened yesterday. And what happened that day basically changed my entire life, destroyed my family, and turned me into someone completely different from who I was before. I guess I should start at the beginning, or like, how everything was before it all went to shit. I grew up with my brother, Brandon, and my dad, Michael. My mom died when I was like 5 years old, breast cancer, and honestly, I barely have any memories of her, just some blurry images and the feeling that she smelled like vanilla or something. My dad raised us alone, never remarried or anything. Said his job was taking care of us and that he'd have time for himself when we were grown. He worked in construction, killed himself doing double shifts so we wouldn't lack anything, and always instilled in us the importance of loyalty and family. I remember he used to tell us, family is the only thing that really matters in this world. Everything else is temporary. But your blood will always be there for you. Ironic, right? Brandon was 8 years older than me, and when I was a kid, I saw him as a hero, like that perfect older brother everyone wants to have. He taught me how to ride a bike, defended me from bullies at school, took me to play basketball on weekends. But looking back, I think there was always something off about him, something I couldn't see when I was a kid, but now makes complete sense. He was selfish in a very subtle way, you know what I mean? Like everything had to revolve around him, and if it wasn't like that, he'd get moody or just disappear for days. My dad always let everything slide because he was the oldest, and I think that spoiled him pretty badly, but at the time I didn't see it that way. When I was 17, I was in my senior year of high school, ran on the track team, and was pretty good. Even had possibilities of getting a sports scholarship for college. It was around that time I started dating Emma, a girl from my class that I'd had a crush on for like 2 years. She was pretty, smart, had this long brown hair that always smelled like strawberries, and when she smiled, I literally felt butterflies in my stomach. We'd been dating for like 6 months and I was completely in love, like that ridiculous stage where you think you're going to marry that person and be together forever. Brandon had met her several times because she'd come over to the house sometimes, and he was always nice to her, nothing out of the ordinary, or at least that's what I thought. Back then, Brandon was 25 and still living with us, because supposedly he was saving for his own place, though honestly he spent money on stupid stuff and went out partying constantly. He worked at an electronics store or something like that, nothing special, and my dad was always on his case telling him he needed to mature and take responsibility for his life. But Brandon was Brandon, always had an excuse or a promise that things were going to change soon. The day everything changed was a Tuesday in October. I remember it perfectly because it was my dad's birthday, and I had planned to get home early to help him prepare dinner. Normally practice lasted until 6 in the evening, but that day the coach had a family emergency and let us out at like 4. I got home whistling, happy because I was going to have extra time to do something special for my dad. And when I opened the door, I heard weird noises coming from upstairs, like moans and movements, you know? And my first thought was that someone had broken in to rob us or something. So I went up the stairs, super quietly with the baseball bat we always kept in the entrance closet. When I got to the second floor hallway, the noises were clearly coming from my room, and I felt my heart beating a mile a minute. I threw open the door, prepared to find who knows what, and what I saw was my brother Brandon and Emma in my bed, completely naked, doing exactly what you're imagining. They froze when they saw me. Emma screamed and covered herself with the sheet, and Brandon just stared at me with this expression I'll never forget, like a mixture of panic and guilt, but also like he'd been caught stealing cookies, not like he'd just destroyed his younger brother. I don't remember exactly what I said in that moment. I think I just stood there in absolute shock, trying to process what I was seeing. Emma started crying and saying things like, "I'm sorry. I don't know what happened. It was a mistake. And I just thought, a mistake? You're in my bed, with my brother, in my family's house, and you call it a mistake? Brandon got up and tried to put on his pants while saying, Tyler, wait, let me explain. We can talk about this. And something inside me just broke. I yelled at him to get out of my room, to get lost, and he kept trying to get closer to me with his hands raised like I was some wild animal that needed to calm down. I ran down the stairs, left the house, and sat on the front steps not knowing what to do. My hands were shaking. I felt nauseous, and my whole body was like numb. I couldn't cry even though I wanted to. It was like my brain couldn't process the magnitude of what I'd just seen. Emma came out like 10 minutes later, still crying, trying to touch me and explain that they'd been seeing each other secretly for like a month, that it hadn't been planned, that it just happened. I told her to leave and that I never wanted to see her again, and she walked down the street with her face red and eyes swollen. Brandon stayed inside, I guess waiting for me to calm down or something. When my dad got home from work at like 7 at night, I was still sitting outside on the entrance steps. He got out of his truck, an old Ford F-150 that had like 200,000 miles on it, and immediately knew something was wrong. He asked me what happened, and I told him everything. Not whining or anything, just told him the facts. I came home early. They were in my room. It was my brother and my girlfriend. I saw how his face changed as I talked, how his hands closed into fists, and when I finished talking, he stood up without saying a word and entered the house with heavy steps that made the floor shake. I heard yelling from outside, my dad screaming in a way I'd never heard him, like basically roaring, and Brandon trying to defend himself, saying I was exaggerating, that it wasn't a big deal, that we were adults and these things happened. That's what finished enraging my dad, that Brandon called his younger brother dramatic for being devastated at finding him with his girlfriend. I heard things breaking, a door slamming, and then my dad came out, literally dragging Brandon by the arm with a suitcase he'd filled with the first things he found. My dad said something to him that I still remember word for word. Get out of my house right now and don't come back until you understand what you did to your brother, to this family, and to yourself. I don't want to see you again until you can look me in the eye and prove to me that you're a real man, not the selfish coward I just saw. Brandon tried to argue, but my dad just pointed at the street and told him he had 30 seconds to get lost before he called the police. Brandon left that night. I guess he stayed with some friend. And that was the last time I saw him for years, like 7 full years without any contact. The following months were horrible, honestly. I had to see Emma at school every day until graduation. She tried to talk to me several times, but I just completely ignored her. My grades dropped, I lost motivation for track, and basically became a zombie version of myself. My dad was super worried, tried to cheer me up, and told me that time would heal everything, but I could see he was also devastated. Brandon had been his son for 25 years, and kicking him out had probably been one of the hardest decisions of his life, but my dad was a man of principles and wasn't going to tolerate that kind of betrayal. Every once in a while, my dad got news about Brandon through relatives, that he was living in an apartment with roommates, that he'd changed jobs like 3 times, that he was dating different girls. But Brandon never tried to contact us directly, never asked for forgiveness, never acknowledged what he'd done. It was like he'd decided it was easier to just cut ties and move on with his life. My dad always said that if Brandon ever came to truly ask for forgiveness, with humility and genuine remorse, he would forgive him, but that he was never going to make the first move because what Brandon had done was unforgivable unless he himself recognized it. Life went on, I guess. I graduated high school, went to college with a partial athletic scholarship, though it wasn't as big as I'd hoped, studied business administration, and basically built a completely new life away from everything that had happened. I had other girlfriends, none serious, because obviously I had serious trust issues after Emma. My 20s were relatively normal. I worked hard, made some friends, and visited my dad whenever I could because he was still living alone in the same house where everything had happened. On those visits, my dad looked increasingly older and tired. The years of construction work were taking their toll, and sometimes I'd notice him going quiet, looking at old photos where Brandon and I appeared together as kids. I missed him too in a way. Or at least I missed the brother I thought I had, not the real Brandon who turned out to be. When I was 29, My dad was diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer. Ironic that it was cancer again, like our family was cursed or something. The doctors told us he had maybe 6 months left, maybe a year if he was lucky, and that treatment could only give him a little more time, but not cure him. I remember sitting in that cold hospital office while the oncologist explained everything with his monotone professional voice, and I just thought, not again. I can't lose my dad too. I notified Brandon through my Aunt Carol, my dad's sister, who had kept in contact with him all those years. Carol had always tried to mediate between us, telling me that Brandon was my brother and that family should forgive, but I never wanted to listen to her. This time was different, because I felt Brandon had a right to know. His father was dying, regardless of everything else. Carol gave him the news and told me Brandon had reacted with shock and sadness. But months passed and Brandon never showed up, never called, never even sent a message asking how my dad was. I left my job and moved back to my dad's house to take care of him during his last months. They were the hardest months of my life, watching him deteriorate day by day, going from being that strong man who raised me alone to someone fragile who needed help going to the bathroom. But they were also valuable moments. We talked about everything, about my mom, about his life, about his regrets. One night he told me his only real regret was not having been able to fix things between Brandon and me before dying, and I told him that wasn't his responsibility, that he'd done everything right. My dad died at home one April morning. I was asleep on the couch next to his bed, and when I woke up, he was already gone. Peacefully, I guess. I called the funeral home, made all the arrangements, and contacted Brandon again through Carol to tell him the funeral would be in 3 days. Carol promised me she'd tell him personally and that Brandon would definitely go. The day of the funeral, a small group of people came, some old friends of my dad's, neighbors, co-workers, and Carol with her family. I waited for Brandon to arrive, looked at the door every time it opened, but he never showed up. The entire funeral passed without any sign of him. The burial, too. And I stood there next to my dad's grave, feeling completely alone in the world. I wasn't even angry anymore, just empty. 2 weeks after the funeral, my dad's lawyer summoned me for the reading of the will. Turns out my dad had left the house, his savings, which were like $80,000, his truck, and basically everything he had in my name. To Brandon, he left $5,000 and a letter that said he hoped someday he'd find his way back to his family. The lawyer gave me Brandon's letter in a sealed envelope and told me it was my decision whether to forward it to him or not. I don't know why, but I kept that letter for weeks without opening it or sending it to Brandon. Maybe I was hoping he'd finally reach out on his own, show some interest or remorse. And sure enough, like a month after the funeral, I received a text message from an unknown number. It was Brandon, saying, "Hey, it's me. I know it's been many years, but I'd like to talk to you. Can we meet?" Part of me wanted to ignore him completely. But another part, I guess the part that still remembered the older brother who taught me to ride a bike, decided to give him a chance. I replied that we could meet at a coffee shop near my house, a generic Starbucks where there were enough people that it wouldn't feel too awkward. When I got to the coffee shop, Brandon was already there, sitting at a table in the back. He looked older. Obviously, he was 37 already, with some gray hair at his temples and wrinkles around his eyes. He greeted me with a nervous smile and said, I looked good. That time had treated me well. We sat down, and there was a super uncomfortable silence until he started talking. He asked me how I was, how everything had been, like we were old friends who hadn't seen each other in a while and not two brothers who had been through everything we'd been through. I waited for him to say what he really wanted to say, and eventually he got to the point. He told me he'd heard about the will through Carol, that he understood Dad had left me almost everything, and that although he didn't expect anything, he was in a complicated financial situation and wondered if I'd be willing to share part of the inheritance with him. That after all, we were brothers, and Dad would have wanted us to support each other. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of all the damage he'd caused, just this shameless request for money wrapped in pretty words about family and what Dad would have wanted. I asked him directly, "Why didn't you go to Dad's funeral? Why? Didn't you visit him when he was dying? Why did you wait until now to contact me, right when there's money involved?" Brandon immediately got defensive, saying it had been hard for him too. that he'd wanted to go but had too much shame, that he didn't know how to face us after so much time. I told him all that was bullshit, that if he'd really wanted to fix things, he'd had 7 years to do it, that Dad had been waiting for him until his last day, and he never showed up. Brandon started raising his voice, saying I didn't understand his perspective, that it was easy for me to judge him when I'd been Dad's favorite. That's when I stood up and told him this had been a mistake, that I had nothing more to talk about with him. I gave him the envelope with his letter and the lawyer's documents indicating his $5,000 and told him that was what Dad decided he deserved, and I wasn't going to contradict his wishes. Brandon tried to grab my arm, but I pulled away and left the coffee shop without looking back. The following weeks, Carol called me several times, trying to convince me to reconsider, that Brandon was my only family left, that Dad wouldn't have wanted us to be fighting. I explained that I wasn't fighting with anyone, that I was simply maintaining the boundaries I needed to maintain for my own mental health and respect for my dad's memory. Carol eventually stopped insisting so much, though she still sends me messages from time to time saying Brandon asks about me. Like 2 months ago, Brandon sent me another message, this one more desperate, saying he needed a loan of $20,000 to not lose his apartment or something like that he'd pay me back eventually. I didn't respond. I blocked his number last week when he sent his 5th unanswered message. Now I live in the house where I grew up, the same house where everything happened 15 years ago. Sometimes I walk by my old room, which is now my office, and think about that afternoon when I came home early from practice. I don't feel that sharp pain I used to feel anymore. It's more like a scar that hurts when the weather changes, you know? Something that will always be there, but doesn't completely define me anymore. I'm still single, work from home most of the time, and honestly my life is calm and predictable in the way I need it to be after all the chaos. Sometimes I wonder if I did the right thing, rejecting Brandon so bluntly, if Dad really would have wanted me to try to forgive him. But then I remember that Dad kicked him out of the house that day without hesitation, that Brandon never came when Dad was dying, and that he only showed up when there was money involved. And then I know I'm doing exactly what I should be doing. I don't have a happy ending for this story. There's no emotional reconciliation or lessons learned about forgiveness. I just have the peace of knowing I stayed true to my principles and my dad's memory. And that has to be enough. Brandon is still my brother biologically, I guess. But he stopped being my family the day he decided his selfishness was more important than the pain he'd cause. And I'm okay with that. Or at least that's what I tell myself most days.